Make sure this is tuned.
Okay. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Araz Salek. I work here at Labyrinth, Ontario as the artistic director. I'll get in details about the history of Labyrinth, Ontario and how it all started in affiliation with Labyrinth and Crete. But first, I want to thank Canadian Music Centre for the opportunity to use this beautiful space. Heritage Canada for supporting this panel generously, and also Toronto Arts Council. Really, one of the perhaps most prominent composers in the musical traditions that we want to discuss about today, who actually founded Labyrinth 40 years ago. This year is
It's the 40th anniversary of Labyrinth
right.
today. Yes, in 1982 we started.
Ross is a composer. He also is a multi-instrumentalist. He, depending on the project and on the different CDs, how many albums do you have, Ross? Over
I've made 47.
47 albums.
Yes.
We've heard Ross play lira, the new instrument that he invented with another luthier, Peter Biffen from Australia, Tarhu, lafta, saws, all sort of different saws and versions of saws, and what am I missing?
Oh.
So depending on different projects, Ross, so a multi-instrumentalist, composer, and teacher. Great teacher. We all consider, myself and a lot of my peers, we consider ourselves students of Ross, and we've always been inspired by his work, his compositions, his musicianship, artistry, and his dedication to promoting and presenting these musics in a rather genuine way. So thank you. Ross is joining us from Crete.
Thank you for the invitation for a start.
Yes. Thank you so much for coming to Toronto. We have a concert coming up on June 3rd, which is tomorrow.
Tomorrow, indeed, yes.
Tomorrow at the Orhan Museum. But also Ross, in the last week, taught workshops on modal music composition and phrasing, which is something that we want to talk about today.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes. Okay.
Is there anything that I'm missing? Well, we probably should talk about the history of Labyrinth at some point.
It's pretty straightforward, actually. In 1982, it started in a rather sort of loose manner as a group of musicians in the city of Iraklio on Crete, which is the capital city of Crete. And we were all interested in exploring various sort of musical idioms which are connected to the world of modal music and which are interrelated amongst themselves. And so we set about, we sort of joined forces together, all of us together, and we were able at various times to invite people from other regions to come and share their knowledge with us and to work with us as well, which is what we did. I then ran a music school in Athens in Greece for several years. And after that, in 2002, we opened the branch of Labyrinth on the island of Crete in our present location in the village of Houdetsi, where we organize every year a fairly large number of seminars and masterclasses, trying our best to represent the entirety of the world of modal music and have people from all of the different regions come. Thus far, we have students and teachers from a total of 40 different countries who come and participate in these workshops and in the concerts which also take place together with the workshops. And we've been doing that in the village of Houdetsi now for 20 years, since 2002. So the total history is about 40 years, starting in 1982, yeah. And we've always been doing the same thing. primarily concerned with education in the field of modal musical traditions.
So I guess perhaps the most natural way to start this conversation is to start with the term itself, modal music.
Exactly, yes.
That's what we refer, and you refer in a lot of your texts and writings. And do you want to elaborate on that?
I'll try and give as brief a description as possible so as not to tire our listeners. There are various different styles and types of music in the world. There is the polyphonic tonal music of the Western world. There is the pentatonic music of the Far East. And then there's a very large geographical area in between those two, which you can say stretches roughly from northwest Africa right up until the western provinces of China, in which we find modal musical traditions. And these are traditions which are based on well, for a start, the vast majority of them are monophonic. They have a single melody line without the use of harmony, quite often quite complex rhythmic patterns, and they also make use of intervals which are beyond the scope of the so-called tempered scale which we use in the Western world. For the sake of being very simplifying that, instead of just having whole tones and semitones, we have an array of other tonal possibilities which we can use, which are smaller intervals and which give a lot of richness to the melodic line, a lot more nuance, so to speak. But that precludes the use of harmony, which means that it is melody and rhythm.
Right.
And the modes themselves are often understood in the Western world to be scales, rather unusual scale forms. In fact, this is not quite true. It's much more relevant to perceive of them as being phrase materials or phrase units, which you might call archetypal phrase units, which each one of these little units gives birth to a myriad of different melodies and different compositions, while always remaining recognizable. It's a rather difficult concept to actually describe to someone, but that's basically how it works. So we have certain traditions. Some of the major and most significant modal traditions would be the maqam system, which is used by the Arab world and Turkey primarily, and also to a certain degree in Greece. Then we have also the maqam tradition is very commonly found throughout the entirety of Central Asia, stretching right up until the Uyghur people of Western China. Then you have the closely related tradition of dastgah in Iran, which is another modal system, which is very closely related to the maqam system of the other Middle Eastern regions. Going further east, you then encounter the raga system, which you find in India, Pakistan, and to a certain degree in Afghanistan as well, in the urban traditions. These are slightly different. They have a certain difference slightly from the Middle Eastern maqam. Without getting too technical about it, they're a slightly different category, but they do remain definitely within the world of modal music. If you look at all of these traditions, what you will see is that they have very strong historical connections, the one with the other, which go back a very, very long time, literally thousands of years. And they develop through a continuous dialogue, the one with the other, interchanging and sharing various elements and various innovations. And so the one basically feeds the other. Well, this is, excuse me, this is the history of these modal musical traditions. In the contemporary world, however, due to the introduction in that entire geographical region of the European model of the nation state, this has happens rather less, this interchange of information and of inspiration. And people tend to become rather sort of locked behind their borders, supporting what they perceive to be an ethnic tradition of their particular ethnos, their particular nationality. And they quite often try as best they can to downplay the contact with other ethnic groups for the sake of what they like to refer to as ethnic purity, which is well, it's quite clearly it's a myth, actually,
Of course.
and that all of these different musical traditions are interdependent, the one on the other. And if each of these peoples has something very beautiful today, which they do, they owe it to this dialogue which has been going on for literally centuries or literally millennia.
Right. I mean, we've had vast immigration from what we call now Iran to Turkey, a number of musicians, but also to the Arab world, but also to the India.
Yes,
But
yes.
and I'm assuming it's been, this, and that is not really so long ago. It's not like thousands of years ago. It's, fairly recent. Like some happened 17th century, right?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
and even more recently, there was a massive influx of Indian musicians into Afghanistan in the 19th century, and there were also major upheavals and changes throughout all of the history, which brought about contact between various different ethnic groups or different regional groups. And there have been, of course, large movements of populations from one region to another, which has brought about a significant influence in the local traditions. So basically, in this entire geographical area which I described previously, which extends from, as I said, from northwest Africa right up until western China, even though you can see very clearly the relationship of the one tradition to the other, and you can actually hear this by listening to these musics, at the same time, in not just every country, not just every region, but almost in every village in this entire area, they have something which is particularly their own, something which is quite unique to themselves, and which connects them to everybody else. For me, this is a very important artistic reality. It's also a very important political reality. I mean, no matter, this is one thing which is perhaps necessary for people in the Eastern world, especially in the Eastern world, to pay more attention to, should I say. I mean, in the Western world, let's say this, no matter what differences we may have, the one with the other, Germans with French, English with Norwegians, or Canadians with Lithuanians, whatever differences may actually occur, everybody loves Tchaikovsky, everybody loves Beethoven, everybody loves Benjamin Britten, everybody loves Grieg, everybody loves Vivaldi. So we have this overarching tradition which joins all these people together and in which everyone can participate. Well, this is actually true of the Eastern world as well in its history. That there was an overarching musical tradition which joined all of these people together in one, into one unit, into one cultural unit, and into one general aesthetic, which had, of course, a very broad scope. It wasn't very narrow, it was very broad. And this is very important both on an artistic and on a political level, that all of these people can feel that there is something here which we can call ours. This is our tradition, and which not just they call it their tradition, but somebody else also. And so this is something shared, which I find that to be very significant. And of course, this participation of many different peoples in a uniting tradition is very interesting for another reason, in that you'll see people looking at the same thing but from different perspectives.
Exactly.
And therefore they can shed light on different aspects of the object in question, which is the musical tradition. And that enables them to learn a lot, the one from the other. And we've seen that in practice in the musical workshop Labyrinth, where every year, as I said, we do have musicians from a large variety of different countries who come from 40 different countries, as I said previously. And they interact with one another, and each of them discovers a lot of new things simply through the contact with other people who are looking at the same subject but from a different perspective. It's sort of very much an eye-opener for all of us.
That's true. I think that's this nationalism in the 20th century or late 19th, 20th century kind of confine all these traditions in those national borders. I mean, geographic borders,
yes.
political borders, and that has not done any good. I mean, the whole project was to build a national identity.
Well, when you add to this the fact that these borders were not actually created by the people themselves, but by the Western powers, it becomes even more complicated and rather uglier, actually. I'm
annoying,
afraid. Yeah. Yes, it's actually something which is rather unnatural for that region of the world, which, for whatever reasons, the world that we're discussing now lived under large empires for a very long time, which, of course, empires, I wouldn't by any means propose empires as a system of contemporary government, no. But there was one thing which was positive, which is that they did tend to unite in a common life and common coexistence. Many different people of different ethnic backgrounds, of different religious backgrounds. For example, you can take the very simple example of the Ottoman Empire, which people tend to rather demonize the Ottoman Empire as being something that they didn't really, they think it was very brutal and barbaric. It did, however, have 4 officially recognized religions as the official state religions, which was Christianity, which included Orthodox and Catholic, Judaism, Islam, of course, and Armenian Christianity. Those are the 4 recognized religions. And this is something which you did not find actually in most of Europe at the same time. So whatever their other shortcomings may have been, and there were plenty, of course, you can look to examples like that which are actually quite good examples of the coexistence of different people. And in many of the regions which are today former members of the Ottoman Empire, you do not find this same tolerance of difference in religion that you would have found in those years.
That's right. Yeah. I guess we're kind of getting off topic, but I don't think we are, because I think these are actually
they're all related.
Connected. They are very related.
Exactly.
I mean,
yes.
it is related when we talk about that overarching culture, or the term I really like using these days is the transmodality. How you you kind of go beyond, because when we were talking about Maram world and the Arab and the Ottoman and then the Daskar system, really most of the time we're talking about same Marams or same modes.
Oh yes.
But called differently, but perhaps really minor. I would call it accent, which reflects on the intervals and the smaller intervals. So I think that talking a little bit about the background of how these are all related, it is actually quite relevant to the topic. But to be a little bit more specific, how do you see composing in these modal traditions different from the other traditions around the world?
Well, of course, the various modal traditions which we do encounter, each one has its own what you might call technical characteristics, which is its forms and the type of intervals which it uses, the rhythmic patterns which it uses. These are the technical side of things. And then, of course, it also has its aesthetic. And aesthetic is always a question of an agreement amongst people who participate in something. It's not really entirely objective. It has quite a strong subjective component. So I think that somebody who is involved in the composition, should we say, in the world of modal music, you have, like in any other tradition, you have the choice of either participating in existing traditions, or you have the possibility of utilizing elements from maybe 1 or 2 or maybe 3 or more traditions in a single composition which will not actually belong to one particular genre, but which will perhaps have reference to various different types of music, but will be somewhat independent of that. So quite often people think of these types of music as being, shall we say, what we call traditional. Okay, And quite often the word tradition is a bit loaded, actually,
Mm-hmm.
with the implication that this is something which is primarily relevant to the past
Right.
and not so relevant to the present or the future. It's not considered to be that which is, should we say, that which is traditional is usually not considered to be contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually considered to be something related to the past.
Yeah.
In my personal opinion, that is a distortion of the word tradition, because if there's one thing which I find relevant to the word tradition, it is the element of timelessness,
Right.
that it's not trapped into one particular segment or dimension of time, but that it stretches over time
Mm-hmm.
with relevance to many points in time. So, in that context, I would see tradition, or the collective knowledge of the past, this huge body of collective knowledge of the past, I would see it as something which is, of course, is there. It has an independent existence of its own, but it is also very relevant as source material for contemporary creation.
Right.
That you can learn as much as you can from the collective knowledge of the past, but not with the intention just of imitating it or copying it or regurgitating it, but with the intent of using it creatively to create something new, which is subsequently our proposal to the future.
Right.
And this is what ensures the continuation of any given tradition, is the contemporary creative aspect of it. So, with that in mind, people who are involved in the work of composing within these various modal traditions or outside of specific traditions, what is relevant is to be able to absorb and digest as much as you can of the collective knowledge of the past, and to find ways to use it creatively in the present in such a way that you're moving the tradition forward with its own material.
Mm-hmm.
This is one thing which is, for me, is very important, because it's become almost, what should we say, generally accepted that in many traditions, especially of the Eastern world, that any form of progress going further is usually just a westernization of that. And that, in my view, is something which is quite untrue, and it constitutes basically a distortion of these traditions. There is plenty of room for them to go forward with their own material. There is no need for them to just westernize themselves for the sake of being popular in an economically more powerful region of the world. And for me, it's very, very important that the people who are involved in creative activity in these musical traditions are able to work creatively with their own material, and to be able to further that and to take that further down the road and to progress it. So that, for me, also is a very, very important aspect of it. So that basically is what I would say about the composition in the world of modal music, is that you have to deal with the technical characteristics, which are quite specific, and they exist for a reason. They're not there without a reason. So if you want to do something different, you have to come up with a reason for it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And also to deal with the aesthetic side of things, which is to work either within a specific tradition and taking into account the aesthetic of the entirety of the people who work with that tradition, who listen to it, or working independently from that and consciously deviating from that in such a way that you're aware of what you're doing. So these are the things which I personally consider to be of importance when composing, is in what context exactly are you composing? Are you within a tradition? Are you working slightly outside of it? And the whole aspect of using creatively the collective knowledge which we have gained from past experience, from the past.
I want to reflect a little bit more on that kind of progress or creativity and the traditions that we're, is our subject or is our topic today, and how that most of the time for me personally, and I see that a lot in a lot of the performances and compositions that typically materializes by either including instruments that do not belong to the tradition, and basically trying to bring a guitar, but most importantly, what happens is to try to get rid of all the intervals that do not exist within the 12-tone scale, the tempered scale, right? And that seems to be the quickest, the easiest way of being progressive.
Yes.
Which is basically you get rid of the pitches that that don't exist in the progressed or considered to be progressive world.
You actually get rid of that which is one of the identifying features
exactly
of the music. Well, the whole concept of progressing further is also connected to which audience are you addressing what you're doing. One thing which has happened is that certain musical traditions coming from the world of modal music, which in the past were not taken seriously, I mean, up until the mid-20th century, the Western world in general considered that we have Western classical music which is far above everything else, and everything else is quite below that, and sort of not of the same significance. It is through good fortune that from the middle of the 20th century onwards there have been certain very sort of luminary figures. I could especially quote the example of someone like Sir Yehudi Menuhin, who he was one of the foremost classical violinists of his day, but who took a very avid and serious interest in various musical cultures outside the world of Western music. One of the prime examples was his collaboration with Ravi Shankar from India, in which he sort of set a very, very good example by showing that he, as a Western classical musician, takes very, very seriously, equally seriously as his own tradition, the traditions of someone else, which I think that was a very, very noble example. This did, I think, perhaps one of the unexpected consequences of this was that due to his interest and later the interest of the Beatles, for example, in Indian music, suddenly in the 1960s, I remember this quite well actually, the music of the Beatles suddenly became quite broadly popular in the Western world. And so we had a lot of artists coming from India to give concerts in major European cities. And what was actually happening in most cases was that they would fill very large halls with people who were listening to this music as a result of fashion and not as a result of having any real connection with it. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay. But what happens is that North Indian classical music is actually a type of music which is quite difficult to understand. It's very complicated, and there's a lot to understand and to know to be able to properly appreciate it. And quite often these audiences did not have this understanding, that they knew practically nothing. And they would see these very beautifully clothed people sitting on a very beautiful carpet and these very ornate and beautiful instruments and this lovely shimmering sound. And they would be enthralled by that for approximately 3 minutes, after which time the piece had another 57 minutes. And what do we do to maintain the interest of the people? This was a problem. And one thing which they did was that they noticed early on that Indian musicians are great virtuosi of their instruments. They're technically extremely skilled. And so they noticed that audiences were quite impressed with displays of technique. Okay, so many of them relied on that quite heavily to maintain the interest of their audiences, who did not really understand the intricacies of raga and tala, which is the essence of North Indian music, which is the melodic and the rhythmic aspect. So they would do these displays of quite extraordinary technique, and this would of course impress deeply the audiences of the Western world. But it did actually damaged the music.
Mm-hmm.
Because we did have in those years, for example, let's take the instrument, the sitar specifically, which was played by the late Ravi Shankar. He was indeed an extraordinary exponent of that instrument, absolutely wonderful musician. We also had people like Pandit Nikhil Banerjee, who was a remarkable exponent of that instrument. And also someone like Ustad Vilayat Khan, for example, who was another great exponent of the sitar. These people in those years, they had all of this remarkable technique, but they also had a really amazing sense of music and a sense of phrasing, and that they really understood the music, and they were able to perform really beautiful renditions of each of the ragas or each of the compositions that they performed. Well, from then up until today, this technique has continued to develop, but I would also unfortunately say that I don't see the same aesthetic today in some of the younger players, because they're still they're trapped into this thing of trying to impress a Western audience because there's better money in the West. And so they're having to make sort of compromises and sort of reductions, really, in aesthetics, highlighting excessively the technical aspect. And I think this has been to the detriment of the music. So it's very important to take into consideration when you're trying to create something, to who are you addressing this?
Right.
So that if you're addressing this to the people who really know and who really understand this music, that's a pretty major and pretty significant challenge.
That's right.
Whereas if you're trying to address an audience who is largely uninitiated into that, it may lead you to distort what you're doing, actually. So this is something to beware of. I think people should always be open to presenting something to new audiences, to new people who maybe hear it for the first time without any preconceptions. That's interesting, of course. But it's also important to balance that with the experience of performing this music for people who have a deep understanding of it.
Right. So speaking of rag and tala, I mean, I myself being a huge fan of your compositions, rhythmic patterns are always, or rhythmic cycles in your compositions are always very significant component of the piece.
Yes.
Would you be able to talk a little bit about how you call it the backbone of the composition?
The rhythmic cycles.
The rhythmic cycles, yeah.
Yes, this is something which, of course, is by no means new. This is very, very old. You see, in the Western world, from one point on, Western music developed a very, very accurate and very advanced system of writing music. And so it was very easy to write things down very accurately, and we can sort of then give it to somebody else and that person can play it. In the Eastern world, people did not develop to the same degree a system of writing, not because they were unable to, but because that was not their prime interest. It never did occur to anybody, and nobody ever thought that you're going to learn a piece of music from a piece of paper. It was always considered that you're going to learn a piece of music from a person, and what you commit to a piece of paper is quite simply like a form of shorthand in a way, that it's just to remind you of what you've learned from this person. So the modal traditions, because they do not make use of harmony, they're purely melodic, they usually are not played by large ensembles. They're usually played by very small ensembles, and in each of these small ensembles, the members of the ensemble have a lot of leeway and a lot of room to improvise or to embellish a melody or to adapt it or to do different things to it. It's quite fluid and quite free within certain aesthetic and technical bounds, of course. It's not sort of free for all, do what you like. No, by no means is it that. So this is an important part of the creative work and the individual artistry of each individual artist, is that how you improvise, how you take a melody and develop it, how you embellish it, what sort of ornaments do you attach to it, and how do you decorate it, so to speak. So this is something which was always quite fluid in Eastern musical traditions and modal musical traditions in general. And so they did not really rely so much on written music as is in the Western world. And one thing which was very, very important in this was the rhythmic cycles. There are some traditions where you find quite intricate and very large rhythmic cycles. I can cite the example of Ottoman classical music, in which we even have a rhythmic cycle which is 124 time, which is quite. This sounds ridiculous to somebody in the Western world, where we tend to have rhythmic cycles, very, very few of which, if any, exceed 10. And this was 120. We have another one which is 88 4 time. We have another which is 28 4 times, 32 4 time, and things like that. So basically, these very long rhythmic cycles are nothing more than it's a rhythmic pattern which goes on, and it gives a sort of a backbone for a composition. So it was the task of musicians in previous ages to memorize these large rhythmic structures, and that's what enabled them to create melodies, some of which are extremely long. One thing you do find in Ottoman classical compositions is melodies which are extremely long, but they do not lose either their direction, their balance, or their impetus. They manage to keep going without collapsing.
Right.
Something which is very, very difficult to do, to write a melody in that fashion. You'll find that in many types of music, melodies tend to be rather short and concise, whereas in Ottoman classical music, you'll find quite long and intricate melodies, which, as I said, they don't lose their impetus, their balance, or their energy. So, and that which is responsible for that is, in fact, the rhythmic cycle, which is sort of underpinning this whole melody and holding it together. And in previous centuries, people would actually say that they had composed a new rhythmic cycle, and this would actually open the door for composition in a number of different modes or a number of different styles. But that which was the foundation of the composition was this large, long, intricate rhythmic cycle. So the rhythmic cycles in different modal traditions, and this is true of Indian music as well, the tala, the rhythmic cycles used in Indian music, are very important in the compositions. So in all of the modal traditions that I know of, at any rate, rhythmic cycles, rhythmic structures, rhythmic patterns are of great importance. I mean, we hear sometimes some very, very complicated rhythmic patterns in Balkan music.
That's right, yeah.
Well, this is intricately connected with the steps of dances. So again, these rhythmic cycles, these rhythmic constructs play a very, very important part in the composition of the music itself.
Thank you. I guess we started with the aesthetics of this music, how historically that has been affected, and we talked about the rhythm. How about the pitch material? Which is, I guess, one of the most significant aspect of these musics, right? How there is no, in some of the marams, there is no fixed pitch material. Sometimes there is, sometimes there is not.
Yes. Well, everything in the modal traditions, they don't really have any need for what we call absolute pitch. What they have and what they find useful is relative pitch. So in the past, instruments would not be all tuned to the same pitch. Each person would tune their instrument according to the way it sounded best, or according to their own vocal range as well, if they were singing and playing at the same time. So there was no fixed pitch for any given piece. You could transpose it to any position you liked, really, according to your own ability, according to your own aesthetic, and also according to your own capabilities. You know, sort of how high or low can you sing, or how well does your instrument respond in this register or in this register. As I said, there was relative pitch. So once you had established the position of one particular note, that by definition would establish the position of all of the others relative to that. And then we get this question of intervals, different intervals. For example, if we take the Ottoman classical tradition, you'll see that the whole tone, which is the space between the note A and B, for example, the whole tone is actually divided not into two equal parts, A sharp or B flat, but it's divided into 9 equal parts. These very, very small intervals, which are referred to by the word comma. These are intervals which actually occur theoretically from the writings of the ancient Greek author Pythagoras, who did various experiments using either a monochord, a string, or on pipes. And so these are things which have occurred ever since then, really. And so within this whole system where you have an octave of 53 intervals, of 53 tiny intervals, this is the whole tone divided into 9 equal parts, you'll find that the semitone is actually only 4 equal parts. It's 4/9. It's not 4.5/9. It's not exactly half. So we do see actual practical differences there. And of course, that's just the Ottoman classical system. In other systems, the Indians have the concept of sruti, which are very small, minute intervals, which have the result that the different tones which they use are somewhat different from those used in Western music. The Iranian system, which I'm sure you know very well, is again slightly different from the Turkish classical, or slightly different from the Arabic, or from each one is a little bit different and conforms to the aesthetic of the different people of that particular region. But the whole way of thinking of the intervals is quite common actually amongst them, that they have a fairly common way of seeing things which relates the one to the other. So all of this is very, very important for them, that the exact nature of the intervals, because that gives really the character and the style to the music. It's very important.
Yeah, and those 1/9s or maybe 2/9s, that does change an entire maqam. It changes its name. It changes how its maqam is shaped. Would you care to?
I can give you an example of that.
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, this is, by the way, the tarhu that Ross and luthier named Peter Biffen
We created together. Yes.
together.
Okay. Here's a couple of what we might call sort of fairly general rules. They're not absolute, but they're they're very strong tendencies, should we say. Let's say we have something that looks like a minor third. If the second degree is a full tone away from the first, then the leading tone below will usually be a semitone. If, however, below the tonic I use a whole tone, then that will tend to lower somewhat the second degree. So we get this. So here's the difference. Or if we have the characteristic 3 semitone gap, which we find, this is very typical of many modal traditions, the use of, I'm playing from A here, A, B flat, C sharp, D. So there's a 3 semitone gap there. Well, we have either a hard version of this where the 3 semitone gap is quite large, or we have the soft version where the B flat gets pushed up slightly and the C sharp gets pulled down slightly. So we get. So we hear the second degree. It's a bit high and a bit low. So this shows you how these intervals are actually used to a certain degree. In each of the different maqams or each of the different modal structures, you'll find different combinations of intervals. The intervals themselves are then organized also into families of intervals which interact in a certain way, the one with the other. Yeah. And it's quite an intricate and quite a difficult process. It takes a long time to learn this. And this, of course, is something which also accounts for the fact that many of these traditions are, I suppose you could say, that sort of decreasing somewhat in popularity, is because these are traditions which take a very, very long time to learn a lot of material, which you have to not only just learn it in your head, but also to fully digest it, so you can work with it creatively without thinking about it. Because any musician will tell you that thinking is too slow for music. You have to have digested something so that it comes out of you in a fully natural way without thinking your way through it. You can't think your way through a piece of music. It's just not possible. That's what you do when you're studying, but not when you're actually playing. So, yes, there's a lot of material which has to be digested and has to be able to be used creatively. And that's why really in these musical traditions there really are no true masters who are younger than the age of 40. And this is now having to compete with various styles of pop music in which your career is over when you're 25. So there's, people are being taught now to want the quick result, the quick fix, so to speak. Whereas these are musical traditions which are for people who enjoy the long journey. And so that's always going to be somewhat of a minority. So that, to a large degree, accounts for the fact that these musical traditions have a hard time maintaining a degree of popularity on a par with pop music, for example. You can't really expect that. But for anybody interested in the long journey, it's extremely rewarding. I can personally vouch for that anyway.
Yeah, so I think that's a good note to end this conversation.
Okay.
Long journey, but rewarding. But very long.
But very long, yes.
But very rewarding.
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And
thanks
I thank our hosts here who had the kindness to invite us.
Yeah.
And so I hope that Labyrinth Ontario manages to interest more and more people in this particular type of music.
Right, to join this long journey.
And to join the long journey and to wish to participate in it as well. That's always important.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.